Hello everyone and welcome to the short video tutorial series of Planet Pro created by Wenjie Chow and myself. I'm Mike Shaw. In this video, let's talk about the focal length tool. The focal length tool is the third tool in the set of photography tools in Planet. The moment you switch to the focal length tool, you'll see a green fan appear on the map. You can drag the fan like this to move it around. And you can also drag the edges of the fan to change the width of the fan like this. And if you notice the focal length value changing as you did that, you're right. This green fan represents the angle of view of the lens at the chosen focal length. Now, if you tap the focal length value here, you can change the focal length directly. Preset values start at 8 millimeters and go all the way to 3000 millimeters. You'll notice the values listed here are not continuous. We only put the most commonly used focal lengths on the list. If the focal length you want to use is not on the list, you can just tap this button to enter in a custom value. For example, let's enter 50 millimeters and tap Set. And now it says 50 millimeters here. This last value is the orientation. You can tap to toggle between portrait and landscape orientation. Note the size of the green fan changes when you do that. That's because the angle of view changes when you change your camera from the portrait to the landscape orientation. Now let's go back to the first value, which is the elevation angle, which is the angle the camera is pointing upwards or downwards. You can't really see this angle on the map, but you can still tap to change it. Let's enter 10 degrees and set. Nothing appears changed on the map, but if we switch to the VR viewfinder, you'll see the change. Let's put the camera pin at the overlook. Open the VR viewfinder. The center of the viewfinder is at a 10-degree elevation angle. I can tap it to change to 0. Here it says 0 degrees. So the elevation angle determines the camera tilting angle vertically up or down. Now here's an interesting bit of Planet Pro history from Wenjie Chow, the genius behind Planet Pro. Do you know what the first feature was that he built Planet for many years ago? It was this tool, the focal length tool. Wenjie planned to go to Horseshoe Bend for the first time, and he wanted to figure out if his lens can capture the whole bend in a single shot. So he printed out a map of Horseshoe Bend and used a protractor to figure out the necessary angle of view. He then converted this to the necessary focal length of the lens needed to capture the shot. It immediately occurred to him that he could create an app to calculate this, which would be much easier to use than a protractor on the map. So he did, and now you're seeing the result. So let's drag one edge of the green fan to include one side of the bend, and the other edge to include the other side. Planet tells us we need a focal length of 22.5 millimeters. So what this tells us is that Wenjie's 16 to 35 millimeter lens can do the job at this location. So he knew before even going there that he was all set for this trip. Of course, at that time, he never knew that the app that had such a simple focal length tool would become such a major app with so many tools. The second value here is the azimuth, or compass direction. You may remember we talked about the azimuth in the previous distance and view tool video, and you'd be right. If we switch to the distance and view tool, you can see that it also has an azimuth reading right here. If I put the scene pin at the far side of the Colorado River, we can see the azimuth value is 282.3 degrees. Now let's switch back to the focal length tool. We see the azimuth again, but with a different value. If I drag the green fan, you can see the azimuth here changes. Now it is 263 degrees, but back to the distance in view, it still says 282.3 degrees. So yes, they're two different azimuths. The azimuth here in the distance and view tool is the direction of the scene location relative to the camera location. But the azimuth in the focal length tool is the direction of the center of the green fan relative to the camera location, or you can think of it as your camera direction. So in other words, the reason they're different is that you're not necessarily pointing your camera directly at the scene pin. The camera direction and the scene may very well be in two different directions or azimuths. Now, I want to show you a useful feature here called the grid lines. You can turn them on by going to Settings, Photography Tools, Grid Lines. Let's choose 1/3, then go back to the map. You can now see the two grid lines in a light blue color that divide the green fan into 3 equal portions, 1/3 apiece. Those lines will help you determine the composition. For example, you can adjust the direction of the green fan so that one of the blue lines points at a particular subject that you're interested in if you want to use the 1/3 composition rule. Now, back to the focal length. When you choose a focal length, you can see two values in degrees under each focal length choice. Those values represent the horizontal angle of view and the vertical angle of view. Now, at some point, you'll probably notice a different reported value for the angle of view in another lens specification. For example, here's a Sony 24mm lens, and here it says 84 degrees. But in Planet, it says 73.7 and 53.1 degrees for a 24mm lens. Several folks have even reported this difference as a bug since there's no mention of 84 degrees in Planet. So what's going on? Well, it turns out that they're all correct. In fact, there are 3 ways to represent the angle of view, as this diagram here shows. The diagonal angle of view is from here to here. The horizontal angle of view is from here to here. The vertical angle of view is from here to here. On the lens specification I mentioned, the diagonal angle of view is what's reported. I guess the lens manufacturer wants to show how wide their lenses are, so they deliberately chose the largest angle of view among the 3 values, which is the diagonal angle of view, just like for computer monitors or screens. But in Planet, we're not interested in the diagonal angle of view, since landscape photographers almost never take photos that are not level. We're usually only interested in the horizontal or the vertical angle of view. And that's why we don't list the diagonal angle of view here. But if you do want to see the diagonal angle of view, you can still see it. Just tap the button here, then enter the focal length you want to calculate the angle of view for, then tap the diagonal angle of view button to see the result. Here it's 84.1 degrees, which is the diagonal angle of view for the 24mm focal length lens. You can also see the horizontal angle of view or the vertical angle of view by tapping the corresponding button. So next time if you try to report a bug for this, we'll know that you didn't watch this video tutorial. Now, every once in a while, we'll get emails asking what sensor size this focal length is calculated for, a full frame sensor or a crop frame sensor. By default, the angle of view is for a full frame sensor, but you can change this by going to Menu, Settings, Camera. Then you can choose the sensor size for your camera by tapping the camera type here. Let's say I want to choose a crop frame sensor, for example, either a Canon APS-C or a Nikon or a Sony APS-C. We'll go back. The 24mm focal length now becomes 15.7 millimeters. But you can see the size of the green fan is exactly the same as before. That means a 24mm lens on a camera with a full frame sensor has the same angle of view as a 15.7mm lens on a camera with an APS-C sensor. You can also choose other types of camera sensors, medium format, large format, and so on. If you have multiple cameras with different sensor sizes, though, we'd actually suggest that you keep the full frame sensor in the settings. You can then do the focal length conversions in your head. Otherwise, if you keep changing the sensor settings back and forth, it's easy to forget which sensor you're using, and you might get a wrong result in your planning. Here, you can also see the sensor height and width for different sensor types. If your sensor is not listed here, you can choose Custom Sensor here. Then enter your sensor's width here, and enter the sensor height here. The focal length tool is a very useful tool to find out what focal length lens to bring before going to the camera location. Here's an example at an overlook in Elysian Park north of downtown Los Angeles. Let's take a look with our virtual VR viewfinder. This is the LA downtown. I can adjust the composition on the map. We'll drag one edge of the fan to include the west side of the downtown, drag the other side to include the east side as well as Dodger Stadium. We'll take a preview through our virtual VR viewfinder again, a perfect composition. As you can see, by planning with the focal length tool, before you even go to the location, you'll know exactly what focal length lens to bring in order to capture this composition. And if you'd prefer a round number instead of 65.7 millimeters, tap it and choose 70 millimeters. So if you bring any lens that includes a 70mm focal length, that'll be perfect for this location. Here's another example. Let's set our camera location at Point Dume, west of LA. The distance is 31.55 miles. That's pretty far away. Right now I still have the 70mm lens from the previous example. It's probably not going to work, but let's take a look at the VR viewfinder. As you might have guessed, 70mm is too wide for the scene at this distance. So let's change the focal length to 1200 millimeters and take a look. The VR is now blank. What just happened? Well, if you use your real camera, you'll immediately know what happened. That's because you're pointing your telephoto lens at the sky and you need to lower it down. But in Planet, it's easy to get confused when you use it for the first time because this virtual viewfinder is not quite as user-friendly as a real camera's viewfinder. So a quick way to fix this is to tap the elevation and angle view, then tap the scene button. This button will center the viewfinder at the scene, which we already set at the top of the tallest building in downtown LA. Here you go. Wow, so this is what downtown LA will look like in a 1200mm lens from Point Dume in Malibu. If I didn't plan that beforehand, I probably wouldn't have known it requires such a long lens. And of course, you're free to try any focal length. What about an 1800mm lens? Sure, that's what the scene would look like with an 1800mm lens. Even if you probably don't have this lens, it's still fun to imagine and plan it as if you did. Well, alright, that's it for this video. Thanks for watching and enjoy learning and using Planet.